Hello everybody, official New York Rail fan here, and today I will be starting a new series for my channel that a friend of mine gave me an idea for. His channel name is Rochester Sub Productions, and his channel link will be down in the description below. Anyhow, as you can tell by the title or thumbnail, I will be starting a brand new series called Engines of Chessie System. This is basically a series where I'll be talking about the engines that the Chessie System had throughout its history. The first episode of this series, I will be discussing the EMD GP9 locomotive. But first, let's go back in time before the Chessie System railroad became a thing. It's the late 1940s, and electromotive division is behind in the railroading market. Railroads were in need of diesel power in replacements for steam power. Manufacturers like Alco, Fairbanks, Morse, and Baldwin already made some diesel locomotives to replace steam locomotives. EMD made the BL2 earlier, but it wasn't really successful, with only 58 units being sold in the 14 months of their production. EMD was trying to look for something different. Then they came up with a new series of locomotives they called the General Purpose locomotives. The first General Purpose locomotive produced was the GP7. The GP7 in particular swapped the truss-framed stressed car body the BL2 had for an unstressed body. Eventually in heavy service with the GP7 though, the frame would bow and sag over time, but they fixed it in the later models of the GP7. The GP7 seemed to be very popular in the market, as EMD was barely able to keep up with the demands for the GP7, even after they opened their Cleveland, Ohio manufacturing plant. This is due to railroads being able to use varying areas of the GP7 in railroading, like road service, switching, branch line service, passenger, and commuter operations. Railroads like the Chesapeake and Ohio, Illinois Terminal, Santa Fe, Chicago Northwestern, Atlantic Coastline, Baltimore and Ohio, Clinchfield, and many more bought these GP7s, and in total around 2,730 GP7s were produced, including 5 GP7B units for Santa Fe, until their production ended in 1954, when EMD wanted to make another general-purpose locomotive. By the mid-1950s, with major success of the EMD GP7, railroads lost a lot of interest in the handsome, streamlined diesel locomotives. The road switcher could perform many more tasks, and it was way safer for crews to operate. In the same year the GP7 ended production, EMD began producing a new, very similar locomotive known as the EMD GP9. The EMD GP9 saw even higher sales than its predecessor, the GP7, and the GP9 finally allowed railroads like the Norfolk and Western finally put steam locomotives out of service and switched to a completely diesel fleet. The reason the GP9 was more successful is because it had more horsepower and it was slightly more reliable than the GP7 they produced previously. The name for the GP9 stood for General Purpose Model 9. The GP9s were rated at a top speed of 65 miles per hour, or 105 kilometers per hour. They had an EMD 16-cylinder 567C producing 1,750 horsepower, compared to the originally 1,500 horsepower engines for the EMD GP7. They weighed in at 259,500 pounds. They had a length of 56 feet 2 inches, width of 10 feet 3.5 inches, height of 15 feet half an inch. They were equipped with a Leslie S3L air horn. Here's an example. A lot of railroads bought the GP9, like the Norfolk and Western, Chesapeake and Ohio, B&O, Western Maryland, Southern Pacific, Union Pacific, and so on. When the GP9 completed its production in 1963, a total amount of around 4,275 GP9s, including 165 GP9Bs, were produced, almost 2 times more than the GP7s. In this episode, though, we're going to be focusing on the Chesapeake and Ohio, Baltimore and Ohio, and Western Maryland GP9s, because those three railroads will soon come together to form the railroad known as Chessie System. First we'll cover the Chesapeake and Ohio, then the Baltimore and Ohio, and then finally the Western Maryland GP9s. These parts will be pretty brief, while going over the Chesapeake and Ohio, Baltimore and Ohio, and Western Maryland. In December of 1954, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad placed an order for about 362 GP9s to be manufactured. These were numbered from 5901 to 6263 and stopped being manufactured in August of 1957. All 362 were kept as high hoods and weren't given chopped noses. There isn't much other information about them, as I assume they were all retired in the late 1980s by the Chessie System. In April of 1955, B&O placed an order for about 225 GP9s, which were completed in September of 1956. Their numbers were 6425 to 6598, 6600 to 6618, and 6650 to 6683. Later, they would acquire 35 GP9s from the Chesapeake and Ohio. Again, just like the Chesapeake and Ohio, all 225 of their GP9s were kept as high hoods and were not given chopped noses. Like the C&O GP9s, I believe the B&O GP9s were retired in the late 1980s by the Chessie. In May of 1954, Western Maryland placed an order for about 20 GP9s, which were all completed by June 1957. The numbers were 25 to 45. Number 33 was GP9 Demonstrator, number 7257. Western Maryland, though, unlike the C&O and B&O, gave their GP9s chopped noses, which in my opinion looked very weird. Just like the C&O and B&O GP9s, I believe Chessie System retired the Western Maryland GP9s in the late 80s. Now that this part has been set aside, we can now get into the 1970s when Chessie System began. The C&O, B&O, and Western Maryland railroads were all very closely related in the 1960s. In 1962, the C&O purchased controlling interest in the B&O. Then they both jointly operated Western Maryland starting in 1967. They all merged together soon to create the Chessie System Railroad, and it was incorporated in Virginia on February 26, 1973. And the railroads fully merged on June 15th the same year. The GP9s continued operating with the Chessie System, with some being repainted into Chessie colors or staying in their former railroad colors. They continued operating until the 1980s, when all of them were retired and stored away. Today, though, you can find a few, I think 2 or 3 of these, on the South Branch Valley Railroad in West Virginia. They have a few interesting locomotives, including a B&O and Chessie painted GP9, which can be found today still actively running on the short line. That brings us to the end of the first episode of Engines of Chessie System. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you guys did, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so I know to keep doing this. In my next episode of Engines of Chessie System, I will be covering the EMD GP15T. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.